Right, let's get underway then. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for your patience. Sorry about that. My name's Felicity Barr. I'm a presenter at Al Jazeera English, based here in London. And we've called this press conference here today because on Monday, a court in Cairo is due to give its verdicts in the cases of 3 Al Jazeera English journalists who've been detained in Egypt since December last year on charges of spreading false information and supporting an outlawed organisation. Now, you probably know that there's been a worldwide campaign to try to win their freedom. And with me here today are 3 staunch supporters of that campaign. Nicholas Piachaud, who is the Egypt expert from Amnesty, Terry Waite, of course, former hostage, and as you all know, Alan Johnston, and also another former hostage and a BBC correspondent over there in Rome. I'll let them speak in a moment, and you can also ask them any questions you like. But first, just a few more words about our boys over there in Egypt. Correspondent Peter Greste, producers Baher Mohamed and Mohamed Fahmy, like most of us here in this room, are all journalists, and they were arrested when they were simply doing their job. Now, if convicted, it's thought that Peter Greste is going to face up to 7 years in jail, and Baher and Mohamed up to 15 years in jail each. There is been a big campaign that we've organised, and Al Jazeera is very grateful for the support of international journalists right around the world. The Twitter hashtag #FreeAJ Staff and the campaign slogan "Journalism is not a crime" has really resonated, and we've been very, very grateful for the support of journalists right across the world. Normally people who are our rivals are now our colleagues and our friends, and we thank you very much indeed for that. Okay, enough from me. Let's introduce our first speaker. Doesn't really need an introduction, of course. Former hostage Terry Waite, held in Lebanon in the 1980s for something like, what, 1,700 days, was it, Terry, I believe?
Yeah, almost 5 years.
Almost 5 years. So he really does know what it's like to be incarcerated. Terry.
Well, anyone who knows Egypt and has respect for that ancient culture can not fail to be appalled by the tragedy that the people there are suffering at the moment. It's a situation which causes great distress to many, and a situation which, frankly, is puzzling to those who have authority as to how to deal with it and how to bring about stability and calm. And so the first thing I would say is I really do have sympathy for the situation in which the people of Egypt find themselves and the government of Egypt finds itself. The second thing to say is that although I'm not a journalist, I've worked in most conflict situations around the world, and in so doing, I've had a lot of contact with journalists. And I do recognise that they have a vital and important role to play in promoting democracy and in speaking out without fear or favour to represent all sides of an argument. Now, I do also understand that sometimes that can sometimes seem irritating to governments, but it's vital that that task is completed, that all sides of an argument are seen. Now, when it comes to the particular situation of the Al Jazeera journalists, I firmly believe, along with many, many other people around the world, that these men were simply doing their job. And in doing their job, were trying to present a total picture, which is confusing and difficult and, of course, irritating to many. Having said that, they were trying to do that. And I think also that if now they were to be released, that would reflect not only a sense of justice in Egypt, but it would also reflect great credit on the government of the country, who are able to say, well, perhaps we in the past haven't liked everything, but we do recognise that it's important that a full picture is put before the public, and we now release these men back to their families and back to do their job. And I sincerely hope that that will be the decision taken when it comes to a decision making on Monday.
Terry, thanks very much indeed. Let's take you from Terry to another former hostage, the BBC correspondent Alan Johnston, who can still hear us in Rome, I hope. Alan, of course, you'll remember, was kidnapped in Gaza in 2007. He was held for 114 days there. And you must remember, of course, the worldwide campaign there was then to free him. Journalists, of course, very much joining in that. Alan, over to you in Rome.
Well, Felicity, in the years before Peter Greste joined you at Al Jazeera. Of course, he was with us at the BBC for years. We were colleagues when I took over in the Kabul bureau in Afghanistan. Peter had done that job before me, and in the days before I went to Gaza, Peter was doing a short spell there too. So Peter and I worked in similar tricky places with the same sort of people covering the same sort of stories. And I know a great deal about the way Peter works, and after he left us, I followed his work through you guys in places like Somalia, Sudan, the toughest kind of place, award-winning work. And I feel I know Peter's approach to this business as well as anybody, and I have absolutely no hesitation in saying that he is one of the very best kind of reporters. He's brave and thorough, and above all, he is completely fair in everything he sets about doing. I can't speak in the same way for Mohamed and Baher because I simply don't know them personally, but everything I've heard suggests that they are professionals of the highest order, and I certainly know that any team that Peter Greste was working for would be operating in exactly the right way. To see Peter and his colleagues in that cage, in that courtroom in Cairo, is a shocking and disgraceful thing. It is terrible that we're still talking about this, having to focus attention on this situation so many days after it began, but it could all end in exactly the right way in about 3 days from now. The judges must surely know that they have innocent men in that cage, and it is entirely possible that they will set them free on Monday. And I think that Al Jazeera has run a fantastic campaign to focus attention on the plight of their crew in Cairo. And I know from my own experience just how very important that can be when you get locked up, imprisoned in this way. It's very easy to feel that you've been buried alive, that the whole world might simply go on, that you'll be forgotten. But in my case, eventually I got hold of a radio and I became aware of that extraordinary campaign that was unfolding. People in the street, journalists, broadcasting organisations like yours were getting behind me, and in the darkness of that place, I can't tell you how very important that was. It was more moving than I can say, and we know that Mohamed and Baher and Peter will be drawing strength from exactly the same kind of campaign. To anybody who's been involved in it, let me tell you that it is profoundly worthwhile, and it must simply continue until those three are free. And on another, and perhaps even more important level in some ways, is that this campaign is touching the people who are behind this incarceration. They can't ignore this. They're being reminded again and again quietly of the injustice that is going on before them, and they know that the world is watching, and they know too that there are people close to them, their colleagues and their friends and their family are perhaps watching this too, and there's no saying what effect that can have over time on even the hardest of men. But I was lucky that I had an organisation of the size of the BBC behind me, and Peter and Mohamed and Baher are similarly lucky. We have these huge media organisations able to focus attention on our plight in such an effective way, but everybody in our room there in London knows that there are hundreds of journalists around the world in jails in places like Turkey and China, Somalia, Eritrea, Iran, all places, ironically, that really need good, solid reporting as much as anywhere else surely does. And when I was caught up in the thing in Gaza, I became uncomfortably aware that I was getting a whole lot more attention than any of those people. Often we don't know their names and their stories. But hopefully cases like Peter's could be kind of emblematic, symbolic of this wider problem, that they can raise the profile of the whole issue of media freedom and the question of journalists being imprisoned around the world. And finally, when it comes to the business of being incarcerated, some things are, I guess, kind of obvious. There is that terrible transition from being a free man to being a captive. Peter and his team would have been working flat out on stories, and then very suddenly they found themselves men in a cell, listening to the door slam and the key turn behind them. It is difficult to convey quite how devastating that is, and very quickly they'll have had to get to grips with that weird idea that their life has taken this utterly disastrous turn, and coping with that mayhem that is suddenly unfolding around them. at the same time, they come into collision with the terrible reality of the passage of time in prison. In my situation, I could only tell the passage of time by the calls to prayer from the mosques in the area where I was being held, and also the movement of a patch of sunlight, a shadow on a bare wall in front of me. And I can't tell you how slowly that shadow moved, and it was a kind of torture all of its own to sit and watch the very slow passage of time in that way. But I guess what I was least prepared for was how very badly I felt for the way I had put my family in this position. I knew how desperately concerned they would be, and they couldn't go on with their life until I was free. And for every one of those journalists in prison around the world, there are hundreds of mothers and fathers and sons and daughters, uncles, brothers, who are living every day filled with fear and concern for that person in prison. And I would just say that I feel so sorry for Peter's mum and dad when I see them going through what they're going through. I think I have an idea what that's about.
Alan, really appreciate those words. Thanks very much indeed. Might come back to you a little bit later. And what Alan was saying is very much tied into the fact that the slogan of journalism is not a crime. He was talking about the journalists right around the world who are incarcerated for simply doing their job. Let me now introduce you to Nicholas Piachaud. He is the Egypt expert, if I can describe you as that, from Amnesty International. Nicholas.
Thank you very much. Mohamed Fahmy, Peter Greste and Baher Mohamed are prisoners of conscience, and they should be released immediately and unconditionally. The men face serious criminal charges, but the real reason they're in prison today is because the government doesn't like what they have to say. The government is trying to stamp out dissent. That means the Muslim Brotherhood, but it also means Egypt's homegrown activists, bloggers and civil society activists, as well as international networks like Al Jazeera. Anyone who does not toe the government line is at risk, and anyone who speaks out is a target. These men have faced 6 months in hell. Since their arrest in December, their world has shrunk to a prison cell and a cage in a courtroom. That time has taken its toll. Mohamed Fahmy and Baher Mohamed spent a month in a maximum security prison. Fahmy suffers from a shoulder injury, which doctors fear may now be a permanent disability. Peter Greste has written of the small joys he has from his pen and paper and books in prison, and his fear that the prison authorities will confiscate them to punish him. These men are journalists, not terrorists. Their only crime has been to challenge the narrative of the authorities. This trial has been a farce. In 11 sessions, the prosecution hasn't produced a shred of credible evidence to prove that these men belong to an Egyptian terrorist organization. Some evidence has been completely unrelated to the case. Other evidence has been unwatchable or inaudible. Technical experts have contradicted their own written testimony. There were also concerns over due process, with the court considering evidence in the absence of the defense, and prosecutors trying to charge the defense 1.2 million Egyptian pounds to view vital evidence. There have also been allegations that some of the students caught up in the trial have been subjected to torture and other ill treatment. All of these men are caught up as part of a sweeping crackdown on dissent in Egypt. Today, anyone who dares to question the authorities is at risk. Rights groups estimate that over 40,000 people have been either detained or brought up on criminal charges as part of the government crackdown. Anyone who questions the authorities falls under the shadow of suspicion. Anyone who talks to the remainder of the political opposition is a target. The government's message has been very clear. If you're not with us, you're against us. And if you're a journalist, it's either our story or no story at all. The trial has laid bare the shortcomings of Egypt's criminal justice system, which punishes government critics but lets human rights violators walk free. It's time for the authorities to stop locking up journalists and start delivering credible investigations into the serious human rights abuses by the security forces over the last year. Courts have jailed thousands of dissidents, but not one member of the security forces is behind bars for the mass killings we saw last year. It's also time for the authorities to abide by the guarantees on free expression in Egypt's new constitution. If these 3 men don't go free on Monday, that constitution won't be worth the paper that it's written on. Thank you.
Nicholas, thanks very much indeed, and thanks also to Terry and to Alan. I'll now do the usual thing of opening up to questions from the floor. If you do have any, can you just raise your hand and say who you are and where you're from? If not, I'll ask some questions.
I'm Barbara Miller from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Oh, sorry, Barbara Miller from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Probably just to Terry and Alan. Different, I guess, from your situation in that they know they've got this court appearance on Monday. They know they might be freed. How, if you could give them advice, how would you advise them to prepare for that day? Obviously, a lot of hope, but the possibility that they could see themselves facing a long sentence.
Well, I had almost 5 years in virtually in solitary confinement for the whole time. And there were many occasions when I was told that I was going to be free, and I wasn't. And what I had to learn was, first of all, never to give up hope. That's the first thing. Keep hope alive. And the second thing is to learn to live for the day, not to try and anticipate too much. You hope, of course, that you will be released, and eventually it happened in my case. But that's the way to approach that sort of situation. And I was interested in what Alan said when he spoke about that beam of light. I was in darkness for much of my incarceration, and metal shutters were against the window of the cell in which I was kept, so I had no natural light. But in the morning I could see a small beam of light which gradually filled the cell. And I remember saying to myself, keep hope alive, because light is stronger than darkness. And in this case, eventually, I'm pretty sure, unless something goes tragically wrong, there'll be a good outcome. What I would say is now to the authorities in Egypt, make sure that a good outcome comes quickly, because in bringing it about, in releasing these men, you'll do yourselves great credit on the international stage.
Alan, if you'd also like to answer that question.
Sure. It's great to hear Terry speak. There is really nobody who knows more about the business of incarceration than him. And in fact, when I was imprisoned in Gaza, during that time when I had a radio, he appeared on the radio sending me a message, giving me advice of exactly the sort that we might be talking about here. And you could just picture the scene, me lying on the floor in the darkness one night and hearing Terry Waite come on and suggest how I might try to cope with this. And the thing that he said is, it stayed in my mind all through my time in that place and afterwards. He said that the mind and the body are much more robust than you might think. He was saying that really you will cope and you will adapt. Of course, it was sometimes extraordinarily difficult to cope, and it will be extraordinarily difficult for Peter and his team to cope, but they are, I'm quite sure, more than tough enough, and they will be coping with this. But it's true that the prospect of release, when it comes close, as it's come close to them now with Monday's verdict, dealing with that hope is difficult in some way. It can just fill your mind, and you know that if it doesn't work out the way you want, it might be the most crushing kind of disappointment. And I remember when there were moments when I thought I might be freed, I really did work quite expectation, because I didn't want to be desperately disappointed. I worried about how I would cope mentally with that disappointment if I let myself buy into the hope too much. But you know, already by this time, Peter's been incarcerated longer than I was, and he is no doubt more than familiar with the multiple mind games that you have to play in that situation.
Anybody else?
Hi, I'm Rachel Jolie. I'm the editor of Index on Censorship magazine. Given the increasing problems of journalists being threatened, intimidated, and sometimes killed in the course of their jobs, I'm just interested in thoughts about what else can be done internationally to put pressure on governments in these cases.
I think that's probably one for Nicholas.
No, it's a good question, and I think we're seeing, across the board a step back in media freedom, and that's particularly the case in Egypt, where you've had journalists being, threatened and harassed, and in some cases even shot and killed while covering protests. And I think particularly in the Egyptian context, what the government needs to do is to basically uphold what it's promised to do. You know, there are constitutional guarantees on freedom of expression. The government needs to start upholding them. It's time to stop locking up the journalists and the government critics, and it's time to start upholding these human rights guarantees that, you know, the government has promised that it will do. You know, when Mohamed Morsi was deposed last year, one of the first things that was promised was freedom of expression. But at the same time as Mohamed Morsi was deposed, the security forces launched raids on, I think, 6 television channels that were seen as, you know, supportive of Morsi's administration. So there was a clear contradiction there, and I think that's the problem at the heart of Egypt today, that they say one thing, but they do another.
Would you like any of the others to answer that? Alan, she's asking that question about what more can be done to sort of safeguard the profession, if you like, of journalism, given that this isn't new. You know, the guys who are locked up in Egypt, as you were saying earlier, are among the many around the world who are targeted by various regimes, aren't they?
Well, one really positive thing is that I think the means for bringing pressure on governments is very much greater than it used to be. We have really effective organisations, people like Amnesty, who got behind me, and Reporters Without Borders, Committee for the Protection of Journalists, hugely active, and at the same time the world's so much more interconnected. People are able to focus attention on stories of injustice. Journalists are able to generate campaigns and bring to light this sort of situation more easily, and through those sort of internet media means there is better scope these days, I think, to bring pressure on governments than ever before. Having said that, you do feel a certain degree of helplessness, and part of it is about continuing to raise awareness. You don't want to suggest that journalists are really any more important than anybody else who are having their rights overturned in those countless prisons around the world. But at the same time, the work that journalists do, without trying to sound too self-important, is part of the business of exposing other injustice, exposing problems, part of the setting of the groundwork for building solutions in countries with the worst kind of problems. It does seem worth the while of governments and aid agencies, media organisations to focus attention on the business of freeing up the media to do its really profoundly worthwhile job.
Any other questions?
I'm Charles Glass, freelance writer. With this your question in mind, on Monday, if these 3 men are released, or found not guilty and released, there is a danger that this campaign will simply die and all the Egyptian journalists who are being held will be forgotten. Is there some plan in Amnesty or Index on Censorship or other organizations to try and, despite their acquittal, if that's what happens, to keep a campaign alive for those Egyptian journalists and obviously for journalists elsewhere in the world?
Yes, absolutely, and it's important to stress that we're not just working on the case of these 3 journalists, but we're working on civil society and other journalists in Egypt as well. The campaign is not going to stop with these 3 men, and that's part of the reason I came here today, which is to say that these men are the tip of the iceberg, and you have dozens of other journalists at risk, and of course, with rights groups estimating that 40,000 people have been detained or face criminal charges as part of this crackdown. What Mohamed Fahmy's lawyer said at the last session was journalism is on trial here, and I think that's very much the case. And no matter what the verdict is on Monday, it's clear that the battle is going to continue, and Amnesty International is definitely going to be on the front lines.
Anybody else?
Given, I guess, the previous 2 questions, if they are released, and maybe this is more for Alan, I don't know, is there a sort of survivor's guilt there because you've been fortunate enough to work for one of the major networks who could put that behind you? The same in this case. Is that something you still have to deal with and expect if they are released, and I know we're getting ahead of ourselves, that you might have to deal with? And then can I ask just a basic fact question, and apologies I don't know it. Why is it 7 for Mohamed and Baher and 15 for them and 7 for Peter?
Let's start with Alan then on the question of, I suppose you put it as survivor's guilt. If they actually are released on Monday, how will they feel, bearing in mind that they know that there are various other people locked up, particularly in Egypt?
Yeah, of course, you know, you're only human, and when you get out of that sort of situation, it is surely one of the great moments of your life, the relief and the joy and the appreciation of just the simplest things, the freedom to eat and drink and choose what you're going to do, to walk down the street in the sunshine. All of that comes flooding back to you, and it is, as I say, one of those extraordinary times in your life. You do appreciate that you've been lucky, that of those hundreds of journalists, you've been singled out by this powerful organisation that you work for and given certain advantages in that way. And certainly I hope that I did things that I could to hope to highlight the problems that were going on among other journalists, and I guess in some way partly that's why I'm here today. And you can only hope that the higher profile cases hit home in a way that others don't perhaps, and it makes people think a little more about journalists getting locked up for simply doing their jobs, and perhaps that makes it easier to take the campaign further afield beyond these more high profile cases, as I say, but it's not easy.
Thanks, Alan. I mean, Nicholas, the question of the possible sentencing, it has been quite a confusing situation, hasn't it, in Egypt?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding was the men face slightly separate criminal charges. So as Egyptian nationals, Mohamed Fahmy and Baher Mohamed were charged with belonging to a banned terrorist organization, the Muslim Brotherhood. The foreign nationals, I think, were charged with aiding this organization. So, you know, the penalties may be different. But if we take sort of a step back, you know, Egyptian courts have been ready to dispense the maximum sentence at a drop of a pin. So there's no telling what could happen on Monday.
Yeah, and I just might to add as well, although the three Al Jazeera English journalists who've been charged and have had their trial ongoing, there are various other journalists from Al Jazeera and various, I think, other organisations as well, though don't quote me on that, have also been charged in absentia. For example, Sue Turton, who's quite a high-profile British journalist who helped organise this press conference, is one of those. She was there briefly, I think, for about 3 weeks in Cairo. She's been charged with the same charges as Peter Greste in absentia. So technically, I guess she can be convicted in absentia and be labelled a criminal by an Egyptian court.
Anyone who's not in the court is very likely to be convicted. So I think we'll see sentences handed down on Monday for those who are not in the courtroom. That includes the Al Jazeera people who are not in the court.
I think, if I may just say in conclusion, what I would like to say is this. It's very understandable that at times of great social upheaval, decisions are taken on the spur of the moment and actions are taken that perhaps are not the wisest of actions, and in some cases are certainly not the wisest of actions. And all I would say now is there's an opportunity for Egypt to put the past in the past, put it behind you, and make a new future. Let the verdict be not guilty. Let these men get out of there, and as I say, start a new future. It's the only way forward in the end, because that will have to happen at the end of the day if Egypt is going to restore credibility as a peaceful and safe place to be.
Is there anyone else? That's quite a good way to end it, if no one has any other questions. No? Great. Thanks again to our three guests, to Nicholas, to Terry and to Alan for bearing with us with the technical problems there from Rome. Really appreciate your support on this campaign. Thanks very much, and thank you also for coming here today. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.